Story. So let's go back to the appendicitis. So he's instrumental. All his gang, all his West Point buddies are colonels and majors. They're all in battalions. They are battalion leaders. Joe Ganow, David Babcock. All of this is well documented on the West Point site. But anyway, so he helps them, and he's coordinating gas and food to run out at the same time, right around the 1st of April. He gets appendicitis in February. He's operated on a field hospital. And George Parker tells him to take a month off, which I don't know how you do that in the middle of a war. But he manages to get better, but not well enough to do any major walking. And thank God for him, George Parker trucked him, because he was on General King's staff, he was trucked to O'Donnell on the death march and saved that whole thing. When he got to O'Donnell, which was 80 miles north of where they were in Manila, my grandfather takes it upon himself to go to General King and said, look, the water situation is beyond description. 12,000 American POWs are drifting in at this moment, and 85,000 Filipino soldiers are drifting in, and they've got one spigot that doesn't work for water. So General King says, you got the job, Colonel. That's a direct quote out of his diaries. And he goes ahead and gets his engineers, which he's also an engineer, to dig some better trenches, get the thing running. Thousands of men are standing in line still for hours all day and still not getting water. Now, to put a perspective on that, that's a stadium plus of people. 100,000 people is a massive amount of people. So he gets the water situation under control, and then for the next 2 weeks, even though he's suffering from malnutrition himself, he stands there at the top of this, as the men are drifting in on this march, and conducts them to shelter, the well, the sick, the dying, and puts them all in barracks, not just for the 12,000 American POWs, but for the 85,000 Filipinos. So this is why, when a guy walked through my living room the other day from Washington who was working on my house, and he stopped in the middle of my living room and said, is that General Shreve? I said, well, Colonel Shreve. He said, my wife's from the Philippines. They know all about Colonel Shreve and the Philippines. And I'm sure it was because of his humanitarian efforts at the end of the Death March. So that's the beginning of that. They're eventually put into Cabanatuan in June of 42. And at this point, my grandfather, of course, has been keeping diaries. He's been, even though it's against Army regulations, he already knows that we're in a critical situation, and he's keeping meticulous track of people's weights, what the Japanese are doing, because they're already violating the Geneva Convention. So he keeps meticulous records. He asks for more shovels and picks, because at this point they're losing 25 American soldiers a day. They're dying. 760 in the first month at Cabanatuan in June. So he's trying to keep up with that, trying to help everybody get what they need to do. From there, it gets really interesting, because at the beginning of 42, Washington has set up this relay of intelligence where they've planned it all out. They've got their Filipino operatives, and they've got this guy, General De Jesus, who's in charge in Manila. And from there, they've got all these intelligence cells fanned out to help these guys in Cabanatuan. Well, my grandfather is on the inside circle of this, because the first letter that goes into Cabanatuan is to Carl Engelhardt, the Japanese interpreter. He's American, but he's a Japanese interpreter. So he's already got the inside circle. Now, here's the thing. Colonel Curtis Beecher, a hardcore son-of-a-gun Marine, is put in charge of Cabanatuan, and he puts my grandfather on the staff. There's only like 12 staff. My grandfather's the executive of the camp. Johnny Johnson, Colonel Johnny Johnson, is the head of commissary. Carl Engelhardt is the interpreter, and then there's a few medics and doctors and this kind of thing. So right away, Johnny Johnson and my grandfather bond together, and they set up an X account in the commissary so they can get in black market food. And they start smuggling in stuff from several different ways and places. My grandfather, through this underground, is able to get notes out of Cabanatuan through either the Carameta drivers or this Filipino internee named Fred Threat. back to Manila and Cabanatuan City, back to the Philippine National Bank, back to Patapsco National Bank in Howard County, Maryland, to get out money to feed his men. So this goes on for 2.5 years.
That's just incredible. I mean, how that could happen.
I know, and my grandfather, Curtis Beecher, asked him right away, we have this one detail, or there's a couple of details outside of camp, but one of them is cutting wood in the Sierra Madres mountains for the kitchen stove, wood for the stove in the mess hall. And my grandfather signs up for it right away, knowing that this is one of those key places that he can get out, right? So he's cutting wood every day. Every day he's out there cutting wood. Sick, well, it doesn't matter, he's out there cutting wood, because while he's out there cutting wood, the Carameta drivers, who are Filipinos from Cabanatuan City, are going through with their bull carts full of food. And he not only trades with them, but he's able to give them notes and stuff that they can take back to Cabanatuan City and Manila. So this is part of how it all goes. Now, Johnny Johnson's doing a phenomenal job back at Cabanatuan, because in the end, he smuggles in $750,000 worth of goods. That's $10 million in today's currency. My grandfather writes checks the entire time, all the way even up to the hell ships, to the tune of $3,000, which is like $30,000 today. So as time goes on, the men are dying off. By middle of 43, half the men are dead. My grandfather seems to be doing okay. They're able to get in some medicine. Red Cross has showed up a few times. But in the beginning of let's go back. Somewhere in the end of 42, the beginning of 43, among a million other things that he does, my grandfather, and I've read other accounts, the clever American, tells the POWs in charge of the pump house and the pump house and the electric, generator, to ramp up the voltage when the Japanese are on their radios late at night. So POWs, when they think the Japanese are on their radio headsets, because of what we think the colonel said, they ramp it up and they blow out their headsets, so they have no radio. So that's what my grandfather does. The Japanese call my grandfather the next day and say, "Can you fix our radio?" So, being the clever American that he is, he doesn't ask for just the broken parts. He asks for 2 of everything. And he takes those extra parts, and he takes his Army canteen, cuts the bottom of it off, builds a crystal radio receiver in the bottom of it, and solders it back together. So he can now listen in to the Japanese. And he passes this radio to Fred Threat, and they take it back to Manila, and they can listen in. They can hear Tokyo Rose and whoever at the Coast Watchers. They can hear a lot of things. We don't know what, but they hear a lot. So on May 3rd, 1944, they almost get caught. This whole MSIX underground Filipino relay almost gets blown. And my grandfather doesn't mention this very much in his diaries, because if the diaries were ever found and they saw this, he would be executed. But he does mention this day. And long story short, you'll have to read the diaries, but Fred Threat comes into camp and whispers to Johnny Johnson that the fat is in the fire. So I think that the code name for this whole operation was Home Fires. And there's reasons for that too. But anyway, almost get caught. They raid the restaurant in Cabanatuan City where Fred Threat's wife works, because she's pretending to be a waitress there. She's really a spy. And the whole thing almost comes crashing down. The Japanese arrest Fred Threat and 12 of his Carameta drivers and interrogate them for the next 10 days. But they eventually let him go. And when they raid the restaurant in Cabanatuan City, everything that they find, all the notes and stuff, are all in code. So they can't name anybody. So thank goodness it doesn't get busted.